About our keynote speaker. Nancy Pearcey is a best-selling, critically acclaimed author. She's a fellow of Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Ms. Pearcey is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, where she is the director of the Francis Schaeffer Center for Worldview and Culture. Ms. Pearcey's books have been translated into 19 languages, and they include Total Truth, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, Love Thy Body, and her book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, provides the topic for session 1. And by the way, Ms. Pearcey is a former agnostic. Please welcome Nancy Pearcey.
My most recent book is on masculinity. So people ask me why I wrote this book, and really what first caught my eye was that it has become increasingly acceptable to attack men, even in established areas like the Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Really? The Washington Post? A Huffington Post editor tweeted, "Kill all men." T-shirts are sold that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." Books have appeared with titles very bluntly titled like, "I hate men," and "No good men," and "Are men necessary?" And even some males are attacking their own sex. One book author wrote, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer." And you may have heard this because it was in the news just a few months ago. The director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was quoted in the news saying, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. Even young boys are under attack. This was an Australian news tabloid. What ideology calls a 6-year-old a potential monster and says we must stop this menace? A psychotherapist who writes for the Wall Street Journal said, "In my practice as a psychotherapist, I'm seeing an increase in depression among young men who feel emasculated in a society that is hostile to masculinity." And perhaps because of this hostility, men and boys are, in fact, falling behind on all levels. All levels of education, for starters. Even in kindergarten, boys have less fine motor control, so they can't work with scissors as well. So already in kindergarten, many boys feel like they're falling behind. They're falling behind girls all the way up through high school in terms of both grades and test scores. Universities are now 60% female students, 40% male. Did you know that? I teach at Houston Christian University. When I started there, about 12 years ago, we were 70-30. And so we started a football team and started an engineering school to attract more male students. And places like Harvard are doing that too. They're quietly behind the scenes doing affirmative action now to attract more male students. There are more women than men going to graduate school and even professional school, like law and medicine. Titles are coming out like The War Against Boys, The Boy Crisis, The Trouble with Boys, Why Boys Fail. So we are failing to nurture boys, and then we blame them for their toxic behavior. And then when they're adults, did you know men are falling behind too, both relative to where they used to be and relative to women, on things like they tend to be more likely addicted to drugs and alcohol, more likely to be homeless, to commit suicide, to suffer mental illness, to end up behind bars. Some 90% or more of prison inmates are male. Men are even dropping out of the workplace. It's not showing up in the unemployment statistics because they've stopped looking for work. And so researchers had to dig deeper, and they now tell us that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. That was a shock, because we all remember what a crisis that was. Great Depression era levels, and male life expectancy has gone down. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend. Men's life expectancy has gone down. A magazine called, here it is, The New Scientist said, being male is now the single largest demographic factor for early death. So how do we respond? And let me start with the good news. It's always fun to start with the good news. We often hear that Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? That any notion of male headship turns men into overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs. It was very easy to find examples from my book, but I'll give you just one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. But social scientists were listening to these accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And in my book, I cite a dozen or so studies. And they found that the facts actually debunk the secular narrative. They found that evangelical family men who attend church regularly, who are committed to their faith, actually test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. Compared to the average family man, American family man, evangelical men are more loving to their wives, more engaged with their children. By the way, when I say more loving to their wives, they do interview the wives separately, which is important. And what I'm really saying is the wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's treatment of them. They are more engaged, evangelical men are more engaged with their children 3.5 hours per week more than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular men, and they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. I was not expecting this, and we're not telling people this in our churches. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. And let me give you a quote. Sometimes a single quote can crystallize it. So this is a sociologist named Brad Wilcox who teaches at the University of Virginia and is the founder of the National Marriage Project. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets invited to write for places like the New York Times. You know, not too many Christians get invited to write there. So this is a quote from an article in the New York Times. He says, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." They focus on the wives because, of course, the assumption is that these marriages are oppressive to the wives. But no, the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And then he turns to his secular colleagues. You know, sociology is a particularly secular discipline. And this is actually my favorite part of the quote. He says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. And by the way, on Amazon, I've had people say, well, what about Catholics? Why is this all about Protestants? Well, they studied Protestants because they're the ones who are being criticized. It's evangelical Protestants who are being criticized. They did also study Catholics, and the Catholics also test out better than secular men. This is not, a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. And so we should be confident about taking it both into our churches and into the public square to show that Christianity does, in fact, have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in my subtitle. By the way, when I say the churches, one of my grad students was the head of the women's ministry in a large Baptist church in Houston, and she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So my book says, no more scolding. Bring this data into the churches and encourage men, support them, affirm them. They are, in fact, testing out as better husbands and fathers than any other group in America. Now, the first pushback I always get is, but haven't we all heard that Christians are just as likely to divorce as the rest of the culture? And by the way, I've done a lot of podcasts on the subject, and often the podcasters said, yeah, I've used that. Wait, isn't that true? No, it's not true. Researchers went back to the data, and they made that crucial distinction between men who are truly committed and attend church regularly. And by the way, just attending church tends to be a fairly reliable indicator. And some research will try to dig deeper, like how often do you pray, how close do you feel to God, things like that. A church attendance pretty much does it. And it's easy to count, it's quantifiable. And so they found that if you take men who attend church regularly over against nominal Christian men who don't attend church, rarely if at all. My students don't even know what the word nominal means. So I tell them N-O-M is Latin for name. And so nominal means in name only. So these are men who might, on a survey like this, they might check the Baptist box, for example, but they rarely attend church, if at all, and it's mostly a cultural background, a family background. And these men test out shockingly different. They fit all the negative stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America, even higher than secular men. Brad Wilcox, the sociologist I just quoted, wrote an article in Christianity Today. And said, the most violent husbands in America, and that's his emphasis, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestants who attend church infrequently or not at all. So it seems that nominal Christian men hang around the fringes of the Christian world just enough to hear the language of headship and submission, but not to get the biblical meaning. And so what they do is they infuse those words with meaning from the secular world. So they think of it in terms of dominance and entitlement and control and so on. So this is a challenge to the church. On the one hand, if you just read statistics on evangelicals, they will be misleading because it'll include men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so the challenge is, how do we support and affirm the men who are doing well? And how do we create a discipleship program to draw in the men who are at the fringes and who are identifying as evangelical, but who are living worse than secular men? By the way, I do get questions, well, why would they be worse than secular men? Apparently it's because, a typical secular guy, maybe who's hitting his wife and kids, doesn't feel any religious justification. But the nominal Christian man will say, well, I'm the head, I can do what I want. Or she wouldn't submit, so I had to put her in her place. So the nominal Christian ends up with the worst of both worlds. So what about the secular world? If I say this, the nominal Christian men are actually living out a secular script for masculinity. What is the secular script? Well, I'm going to start with the good news. Again, there's good news even in the secular world. A few years ago, an anthropologist did the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And what he found is that despite the cultural differences, all cultures have a common code, a universal code for manhood. And he calls it the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. Become a father, build into the next generation. So around the globe, even in countries that have no Christian background, men seem to have an innate, inherent sense that their unique masculine strengths are not given them to get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, to care for those that they love. So how I would put it is they're all made in God's image. They're made in God's image. They do understand what it means to be a good man, even without a Christian background. And so this does give us a better strategy for dealing with these issues, right? Most men do not respond very well to being called toxic. Nobody would. So what we can do is instead, can we tap into, can we affirm, can we support that innate universal sense of what it means to be a good man? How God has created the male character, the creational givens. And then there's another study, again, neither of these are by Christians, and this is by a sociologist. And he found that there were actually two conflicting scripts for masculinity that men feel trapped by. Now, he's very well known, and so he speaks all around the world, and he came up with a very ingenious experiment where he asks young men two questions. First, what does it mean to be a good man? You're at a funeral, and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologists said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing things like duty, honor, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologists would say, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. So there it is again. Men are made in God's image, and all around the world, they do inherently, innately, intrinsically know what it means to be a good man. But then he follows up with a second question. He says, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, oh no, that means be tough, never show weakness, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, and get laid. Oh, I missed win at all costs. Anyway, I'm using their language, right? So once again, all around the globe, men have an innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man, but they also feel cultural pressure to be the quote-unquote real man, which includes quite different traits. Right? And not all of them are bad. Of course, we want men who can hang tough in a crisis. But if this script is disconnected from the script for the good man, a moral vision for masculinity, then it can slide into things like entitlement and dominance, misogyny, and contempt for those who are weak. We might call this the Andrew Tate script, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast women. In response to the masculinity crisis, we are seeing a growing trend of young boys especially reaching out to Andrew Tate. You guys do know who I mean by Andrew Tate, right? Because I have found some audiences aren't quite up on that yet. Okay. By the way, there's somebody a man who was hailed in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate. Some of you know him. Do you know Myron Gaines? So he has a program that's becoming very popular called Fresh and Fit. And his tagline is, I help men transform from simps into pimps. And in his book, yes, he did write a book, he says all relationships are basically prostitution. All men are Johns, all women are whores. And I heard from this from a close friend who's a Christian who said, oh, you need to watch this program, it's really good. And a former graduate student of mine now teaches high school. And she wrote me an email saying, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. That was a big surprise. So the next question is, where did this secular script for manhood come from? You know, you cannot really stand against a trend, a social trend, unless you know where it came from and how it developed. So let's look at, most people think the negative language toward men started 1960s, second wave feminism. No, it started much earlier. We have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because before that, men worked with their wives and children all day, right, on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. The cultural expectation on men focused on their caretaking role. In fact, here's a surprising fact. Most of the literature on parenting and child-rearing was addressed to fathers. If you go in a bookstore today, most of them are to mothers. But fathers were just as involved with their children as mothers were, especially their sons, right? The sons were basically apprentices in their father's craft or trade. And even secular historians say things like, masculine virtue was defined as duty to God and man. So how did we lose this concept of masculine virtue? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had little choice but to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, men were not working alongside their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And in the literature of the time, we begin to see people protest that men were changing, that they were losing the caretaking ethos of the earlier age. They were becoming egocentric, self-interested, aggressive, greedy, acquisitive, using the language of the day, and even turning their career into an idol. It was interesting how often they used that term in the 19th century. So this is when we first see negative language applied to the male character, and especially fathers. With fathers out of the home all day, they were not as tuned into the family dynamics. They were not as aware of their children's thoughts and needs. So already in the 19th century, fathers began to be painted as out of touch, irrelevant, superfluous, and incompetent. Do you see the seeds of the Homer Simpson paradigm? I was surprised at how early this language started. So today, what? Fathers are often portrayed as incompetent bumblers, right? They're patronized by their long-suffering wives and their clever children. My own son loved the Berenstain Bears. We read them all, but, even the kids are smarter than their dad. Father absence affected especially boys. And so this meant there was a problem with the next generation as well, not just the first generation that went into the offices and factories, but what about the next generation that for the first time were being raised without their fathers? A sociologist said, for the first time in American history, young men experienced an identity crisis. A historian says boys grew alienated from their fathers and from the world of adult males. Robert Bly, some of you may know because he's the founder of the contemporary men's movement, writes, the love unit most damaged by the Industrial Revolution was the father-son bond. He calls it industrial fatherlessness. Because fathers are technically in the home, but they're out of the home all day. Commentators at the time noticed that boys' behavior was growing worse. They were growing up without their father's supervision. They were becoming wild, unruly, and unmanageable. This is when the people began to say, well, boys will be boys. Nobody said that before. Nobody expected boys to behave worse than girls. At the time, as a leading psychologist of the time actually wrote, never has the American boy been quite so wild as now. Never in the world have so many young cubs been half orphaned because they're growing up without their fathers, and left to female guidance in school, home, and church. Now, at the same time, America was growing more secular. After the Industrial Revolution, there emerged a large public realm, right? Factories, businesses, financial institutions, universities, and of course the state grew a lot larger too. And people began to say that morality had no place in the public realm, that these large institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they really meant value-free, right? Don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. Right? And because men were the ones getting that secular education and working in that secular realm, they became secular in their thinking earlier than women did. Here's how one historian puts it. Exposed to a competitive, acquisitive economic world, and often to a secular education, many men lost an active religious sense. So this is when a secular script for masculinity began to take hold. And through my book, Toxic War and Masculinity, I give several turning points in the development of the secular script. But to condense it, I'm going to give you just one. And this was the rise of Darwinian evolution. And this is a bit of a surprise because most people think, well, that's about science, right? But it had a huge impact on concepts of masculinity. Because social Darwinists began to say that in the struggle for survival, the men who came out on top were ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and sexually predatory. In an earlier age, Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, but the social Darwinists urged men to live down to what they called the beast within. That was their true nature. By the way, social Darwinism has reappeared in our own day. It's got a new label. It's now called evolutionary psychology. But it has the same message. Look at this. This is a best-selling book called The Moral Animal. And it says, human males are by nature oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pigs. Giving them advice on successful marriage is like offering Vikings a free booklet titled How Not to Pillage. I thought, how can you get away with this? I mean, this is worse than any feminist. This is more derogatory toward men than any feminist. And an older book was just reissued. Some of you may have seen this in the past. It's by George Gilder, called Men in Marriage. And he says, men are by nature violent, sexually predatory, and irresponsible. The greatest yearning is not for a wife and family, but for the motorbike and the open road, the male group escape to a primal mode of predatory and immediate gratification. Are you seeing the origin of the Andrew Tate phenomenon? It doesn't come out of nowhere. Serious thinkers have been saying this. These are the ideas that are fueling the manosphere today. You're familiar with the term manosphere, right? These online groups that are very misogynistic and saying, don't marry, use women just for sex, but that's all they're good for. So let's talk about solutions. If the alienation of young men began when fathers started working outside the home, it's clear that the long-term solution has to be reconnecting fathers to their sons. One psychologist puts it this way: we're not going to raise a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers. Boys who have no father in the home are more likely to have all the social pathologies, problems in school, run away from home, addicted to drugs and alcohol, end up behind bars. I used to work at Prison Fellowship. Some of you, you mentioned it last night, I worked for Chuck Colson. And we knew this all too well, that the majority of young men behind bars, especially for violent crimes, were from fatherless homes. The numbers, in the 80% or so. This sociologist says, boys raised by traditionally masculine fathers generally do not commit crimes. Fatherless boys commit crimes. Growing up without a father has a greater impact than race, poverty, or education. And today, about 40% of American children are growing up apart from their natural father. It's the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. Can you imagine what we're on top? We rate highest on fatherless homes. So let's look now at the positive data to get a sense of how to fix this. There was an award-winning 35-year longitudinal study that looked on how parents succeed in passing along their religious faith, their moral and spiritual convictions. And the study found two surprising results. First, having a close bond with the father matters more than a close relationship with the mother. And my female students say, well, that's not fair. Sorry, it's a fact. If a father is an active religious participant, the children are much more likely to follow him. Mothers have some influence, but just not as much. Second, the relationship with the father must be warm and close. If the father is a leader in the community, a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, perfect theology, but if he's perceived as cold, distant, and authoritarian, his kids won't follow him. They will not follow him into the church. They will not adopt his spiritual and religious convictions. There was another study that was done on purely secular grounds on how to raise masculine boys. And it was fascinating because, once again, they found that the key was a loving relationship with the father. And the interesting thing was that the father's own masculinity was irrelevant. In other words, whether he was macho or whether he was more gentle, that did not play a role. What made a difference was the warmth and closeness with his son for creating a secure sense of masculine identity. What about policy recommendations? I recently spoke at the Heritage Foundation, and do you guys know the Heritage Foundation in Washington? The largest conservative think tank in the nation. So they invited me on a panel on the boy crisis. So of course I had to come up with some policy recommendations for that audience. The pandemic was a game changer. Harvard University did a study. It's not in my book because it's that recent. And they found that during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said that by working from home, they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. They want to have some sort of at least hybrid setup so that they can be closer to their children. And so government policy, speaking of policy, it should reward corporations that create father-friendly practices. When they talk about family-friendly practices, they usually mean mothers. We need to think about father-friendly practices, flexible work hours, hybrid arrangements, and so on. And of course, you have to get the corporations on board too. But during the pandemic, corporations changed. I think I have a slide. One CEO says, during the pandemic, our bias against working from home has completely exploded. Our company was not seeing any discernible drop in productivity. And the government, of course, can also partner with national fatherhood groups. There's something called the National Fatherhood Initiative. And then, of course, I always get the question, what about fatherless boys? What about boys who don't have a father? Policies can support programs for them too, because research has found that father substitutes can have a huge impact. Grandparents, uncles, teachers, coaches, and church youth pastors can have an enormous impact on young men growing up. I just spoke in Dartmouth like 6 days ago in Alabama, and the pastor of that church said his father left when he was 4. It was the men in the church who raised him. And so in my book, I do say churches should really consider creating ministries for fatherless boys. And that does mean it's an issue that all of us can contribute to solving. Thank you very much.